Hey, welcome. Thank you, Kendra. So welcome to today's Motivated Cognition meeting. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Holly Bowen. Dr. Bowen completed her PhD in cognitive neuroscience at Ryerson University, now known as Toronto Metropolitan University, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Boston College. Dr. Bowen is now a assistant professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Her work focuses on how emotion and motivation influence how we form memories and remember past experiences, and how this changes across the lifespan. She uses multiple methods, including behavioral paradigms, computational modeling, and neuroimaging, to better understand the cognitive and neural mechanisms that support affect-modulated encoding and retrieval. Today, she will be talking to us about reward-motivated memory in younger and older adults. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bowen.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming today, and to Kendra for inviting me. I'm excited to share a line of work that I started as a graduate student some time ago. I'm continuing this line of work, but I won't talk about my most recent findings on directed forgetting, but happy to discuss that afterwards if that's something you're interested in. When we think about aging, one of the things that often comes to mind is cognitive declines, memory problems, but I hope that these data might convince you that it's not all bad, that some things are maintained in aging. And to me, that's kind of the interesting and exciting aspect of studying aging when things are going right. So motivation, by definition, leads to goal-directed behavior and goal-directed cognition. I don't really need to tell this group that. But for example, if you have an interest in a subject matter, that intrinsic motivation can lead to better memory for that information. What I'm going to talk about today is extrinsic motivation, so sort of this donut situation where there's some type of reward that you're willing to work for in order to get it. So maybe you can relate to this person on the treadmill. So the question that my colleagues and I and lots of other researchers have been exploring is whether motivation can still modulate our cognition as we age. So can older adults kind of flexibly cognitively control their memory to remember things that are valuable if we give them some extrinsic motivation or incentive to do so? And there are a number of kind of interesting reasons to ask this question. So first, even when pathology is not present, healthy aging is associated with neurocognitive changes. One of those changes is dopaminergic decline. So this picture is showing loss of dopaminergic activity in aging as seen with a PET scan. So this is comparing a healthy 25-year-old woman to a healthy 70-year-old woman. And you can see there's pretty stark changes to dopaminergic activity. Incentive processing is associated with activity in this dopaminergic midbrain. So if that's the case, then incentive processing should theoretically undergo age-related changes. But what I'm going to show you today is, despite some of these changes in dopamine in the brain, activation of the reward circuitry actually remains relatively intact or maintained in healthy aging. So one of the lab-based tasks that we use to examine activity in the reward network is this monetary incentive delay task. So this task and a similar one will feature pretty prominently in this presentation, so I'll just detail the specifics of it here. It's a simple reaction time task where the participant is asked to hit a button when a star briefly appears on the screen. The amount of time the star stays on the screen speeds up and slows down based on that individual's own reaction time. So the participant gets a hit rate of about 66%. So in this task, participants are put into a state of reward anticipation or loss anticipation on a trial by trial basis. So at the beginning of each trial, they get a cue indicating how much they can earn in the case of a reward, or avoid losing in the case of loss anticipation if they successfully hit that star on time. After the star, they get some feedback telling them how they did. So Samantha Larkin and colleagues were able to demonstrate that a reward region, which I'm showing here, it has a little red highlight, a reward region, this is the ventral striatum, remained sensitive to rewards in older adults. So you can see that activation in that region ramped up the more that that reward cue was worth. But, and this was true in younger and older adults, but older adults showed reduced sensitivity to loss signals. So the part on the left. So even though for younger adults, this area was still ramping up for increased losses, this was not true for older adults. So the ventral striatum remained sensitive to rewards in older adults, but showed reduced sensitivity to loss signals. Now, this was a region of interest analysis and ROI analysis where they specifically probed kind of this one region of the brain. But we know that complex cognition, cognitive processes are not localized to a single brain region. And so we wanted to follow up and extend this work to examine what was going on in the rest of the brain during that reward and loss anticipation phase. So we used this MID STAR task while participants were in the MRI scanner. In this case, we had 16 younger adults around age 25 and 15 older adults around age 69. And we had 4 different trial types. So during this anticipation phase, there were gain and loss cues, so win or lose $5. So that was our high reward value. And we also had non-gain and non-loss anticipation, a win or lose cue of $0. So this is the behavioral performance on this task. So in this graph, we're showing the reaction times to that star. And younger adults are in white bars, older adults are in the gray bars. So what you'll notice is that younger adults are reacting much faster. So the reaction times are faster for those $5 cues. So when there was a win cue of $5 or a loss cue of $5, younger adults were able to speed up and hit that star faster. No difference between the different valences. Older adults, on the other hand, their reaction time remained pretty consistent across the different conditions. So no effect of valence or of reward here for older adults. So to analyze the brain data, we used partial least squares or PLS analysis, which you may or may not be familiar with, but I'll just kind of give you a brief overview of this type of analysis. It's a multivariate spatial temporal whole brain analysis. So PLS operates on the covariance between the experimental design and the brain voxels, and it helps identify orthogonal variables or so-called latent variables that optimally relate these two sets of measurements. So we think of it, or you can think of it as a data-driven approach. So instead of giving it a priori contrast or specific brain regions that you want to probe, you give it the data, the timing of your different conditions, the brain voxels, and it pulls out the most significant patterns in the data. So first, we're going to focus on the patterns associated with this reward anticipation phase. So we have 4 different conditions that we're looking at: gain and loss of $5 or non-gain, non-loss of $0. So this analysis gave us 2 significant latent variables with 2 different patterns. So the first latent variable accounted for almost 60% of the variance, and it suggested age-independent effects. So you don't need to be concerned with the actual values in this graph, but rather just the pattern of the bars. So you can see the 4 different conditions that we have along the bottom. Younger adults are in white and older adults are in gray. So what you'll see is that older and younger adult bars are moving in the same direction. And we have positive bars for the win and lose $5 and negative bars for win and lose $0. So I'm going to show you the brain pattern that is associated with this LV, which is basically an affective value, which is valence and age independent. So we don't see any differences between gain and loss or younger and older adults. So this is the pattern that we find when participants are processing that win and lose $5 cue. So these are the brain regions that are active during that processing. What we find is basically a lot of what you might consider reward network, if you like to use that term. So midbrain, ventral striatum, insula. So you can see quite a bit right in this area here, if you can see my cursor. So this is the pattern associated with older and younger adults processing $5 cues, whether it was gain or loss. They're using the same network of regions across age and across valence. And some other regions in there as well. The second pattern that we found accounted for about 14% of the variance. So this second LV was an age variant pattern. So now you can see across the four conditions that younger and older adult bars are going in different directions. So this suggests that younger and older adults are doing something different during that anticipation phase across the different conditions here. So I'll show you, so this is an interaction of age and incentive magnitude. Again, no affective valence. We don't find any pattern that's associated with gains versus losses. So here we find that older adults, in addition to using those reward network regions that I showed you in the first LV, they are additionally recruiting some extra regions when they're processing those $5 gain and loss cues. And those regions are mostly what you might consider default network regions. So bilateral posterior cortex, precuneus, posterior cingulate, as well as regions that might be considered cognitive control regions. So we're getting some lateral prefrontal cortex involved. So these are regions that older adults are recruiting to process those high value gain and loss incentive cues. And younger adults do not activate these regions. So older and younger adults are recruiting the reward network to the same extent to process these cues, but older adults are sort of recruiting or over recruiting default network and cognitive control regions in response to these same cues, and younger adults are not. So next we wanted to look at what was going on in the brain during the reward and loss feedback. And so here we just focused on trials where there was $5 at stake. So we have 4 different trial types. So on these $5 trials, you could get a cue that said win $5. And if you hit the star on time, you get feedback that says hit plus $5. But if you miss the star, then you don't get your $5. So it would say miss plus 0. In the loss condition, if you had a cue that said lose $5 and you hit the star on time, you avoid losing that $5, so minus 0. But if you miss the star, then you would lose the $5 of minus 5. So here we did another PLS analysis to look at what was going on during feedback, but we did a PLS functional covariance analysis using seed voxel PLS. So we chose these seeds a priori. We chose the medial frontal cortex, which is involved in feedback processing more broadly. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex is thought to play a role in coding the subjective value of a reward, monitoring the outcome of current choices. And then we also chose a seed, the caudate, the right caudate right here. This is part of the dorsal striatum, has also been implicated in reward processing and a lot of other work. So by including these seeds in the analysis, we are mildly constraining the analysis in the sense that we are looking for the strongest patterns in the data, but that a pattern that includes these two seeds. So the functional covariance between these seed regions and the rest of the brain, given our 4 task conditions, our 4 types of feedback. So I'll show you the pattern that we find. We get a significant latent variable. It accounts for about 55% of the variance. And I'm calling this kind of a general feedback network. So this is a network of regions that is activated across the different types of feedback, across the 2 age groups, across hit or miss. So we're getting a network of regions that helps older and younger adults process feedback regardless of the valence and regardless of the actual monetary outcome of that trial. So the pattern associated with this latent variable is here. So it includes some reward network regions, dorsal and ventral striatum, as well as thalamus, cingulate, middle and superior temporal gyrus. So sort of a wide network of regions that is working together to help both younger and older adults to the same extent process these different types of feedback, regardless of valence and regardless of the amount. So what I've shown you so far, these findings indicate that older adults can and do engage the reward network and similar brain regions as younger adults to process these different incentives, different types of feedback. And so next we asked whether healthy older adults can tap into this preserved motivational processing to modulate declarative memory. So declarative memory is one of the areas of cognition that we know declines with age. So do healthy and older adults exhibit reward modulated memory? So Alan Castell's lab at UCLA has shown in many different papers that younger and older adults remember words that were paired with a high point value compared to a low point value. So they tend to show the same pattern here, which they call selectivity. Work from Mara Mather's lab, participants in their study saw pictures of objects and monetary incentives were present in the task, but were actually incidental to the memory performance itself. So both younger and older adults' memory performance benefited from the presence of having a monetary reward just in the task, even though they weren't getting rewarded for their actual memory performance. So we wanted to build on this work and extend these findings to recognition memory for items that had been intentionally encoded in the context of a high or low value reward anticipation. So this is the monetary incentive encoding task. It looks very similar to the reaction time MID star task I talked about. Participants in this task are shown images that they intentionally encode for a memory test that they know will come later. Before each image, they get a cue, putting them into a state of reward anticipation. And this tells them how much that image is worth if they recognize it on the subsequent memory test. So in this study, this is just a behavioral study where we had participants come to the lab and we used high value cues of $1 and low value cues of 1 cent. We did a recognition task 24 hours later. And so here, if participants stay old to a target item, so one that they had seen before, they get a hit, and they earn either the $1 or 1 cent that it had been paired with at encoding. But if they commit a false alarm, meaning they stay old to something that's actually new, they lose 50 cents. And we employed this false alarm penalty so that participants don't have a little response bias where they just stay old to everything and then they get all the rewards and your memory performance is basically at ceiling or 0, depending how you calculate it. So this is the behavioral performance. This is recognition 24 hours later after encoding. Younger adults are on the left, older adults are on the right. High reward items are in green and low reward items are in white. So this is D prime. So this is looking at recognition memory, taking into account both hits and false alarm rate. So older adults on the right, you can see are performing worse overall compared to younger adults. But what's interesting is that they show the same pattern of reward sensitivity. So they're showing the same pattern as younger adults, where they can remember those high value items to a greater extent than the low value items. So both younger and older adults have better memory for those high value items compared to low value images. Next, we wanted to figure out what memory-related process is driving this effect. So we ran a second experiment, and we wanted to first replicate our findings from that first experiment. Does reward enhance memory formation in younger and older adults? And second, we wanted to test more directly the hypothesis that the reward effect on memory is reflecting enhanced memory consolidation rather than just preferential encoding of high reward stimuli. So if it's preferential encoding, meaning that participants are really paying a lot of attention to the high value items, or maybe they have a really good strategy that they employ for those high value items that they don't employ for the low value items, or maybe they try to ignore the low value items. If it's just something that's going on at encoding, we should see an enhancement of memory both on an immediate test and a delayed test of memory. On the other hand, if reward anticipation is driving consolidation processes, which are time dependent, so reward maybe signals to your brain that this information is important or salient. And when you go to sleep that night, reward is leading to sort of dopaminergic modulation of hippocampal replay. It's prioritizing and solidifying that memory trace for those high value items over low value items. If that's the case, reward effects on memory should only be observed after a delay when these consolidation processes have had a chance to unfold. So we shouldn't see an effect on an immediate test of memory. So we repeated the experiment that I just showed you, but we added a within subjects manipulation of retention intervals. So half of the items are tested on the same day, and half of the items are tested on 24 hours later. So this is the delayed memory test. So this is showing basically a replication of the first experiment we ran. Again, we find older adults do worse overall, but both younger and older adults are showing that reward enhancement on memory. So those high value items are remembered better than the low value items across age. This is the immediate test on memory. So what we find here, memory performance is boosted, of course, overall, but we do not find an effective reward on this immediate test of memory. So this is some behavioral evidence that reward anticipation might lead to dopaminergic modulation of hippocampal long-term consolidation processes rather than just kind of preferential strategies or encoding when participants are seeing those items during the encoding phase. So this is some behavioral evidence that older adults do show the same pattern as younger adults, and they exhibit reward modulated memory, and that this process might be tied to consolidation processes rather than just sort of preferential or good encoding strategies that are employed for high but not low value items. Now, this doesn't really tell us what's going on in the brain. So even though younger and older adults are showing the same behavioral pattern, do younger and older adults use the same brain regions to actually do this task? So to complement these behavioral results, we turned back to MRI and repeated this experiment in the MRI scanner. So going back to results that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, this is when we were just looking at the reward anticipation effects during that MID STAR task. Here we found age-independent effects where both age groups were engaging the reward network during reward anticipation to the same extent. But older adults were also recruiting some additional regions. So there were some age differences during that anticipation phase. Older adults were recruiting some frontal regions to a greater extent that younger adults were not recruiting. And engagement of frontal regions fits with a lot of findings in the cognitive aging literature that when when you see that older and younger adults are kind of performing at the same level or similarly, it's often the case that older adults are recruiting additional regions of the brain to get their performance to that level. Now, we found these effects, as I mentioned, this neural pattern to monetary incentives, but this was not within the context of the memory paradigm. So it's just within that MID star task. So we wanted to look at what was going on in the brain during the memory task to see what could predict older and younger adults' performance. At the time that we published this study, there were only 2 studies that had examined the neural responses associated with reward modulated memory in older adults. And essentially, both of these published studies found that when looking in an ROI or region of interest that included the reward network, so this is an image of the ROI that was used in the Cohen et al. Paper, that activity within this ROI or this reward network during the reward anticipation stage did not support memory for older adults. And this was kind of surprising because there was quite a bit of evidence from younger adults indicating that activation in the reward regions during reward anticipation did actually predict memory performance on the subsequent task. But that was with younger adults. So even though we've seen that younger and older adults are kind of showing the same effect behaviorally during the memory task, they seem to be doing something different neurally to support this behavior. So we asked this question of how does reward anticipation modulate declarative memory formation in healthy older adults? These studies would suggest that it's not activation in the reward network. And so we decided that we needed to look outside of the reward network. So in this study, we examined functional connectivity between reward regions and the rest of the brain during reward anticipation. So based on these previous findings that I'm showing here, that in addition to recruiting the reward network, older adults rely on frontal regions to process monetary incentives. We hypothesized that there would be greater connectivity between a reward region and frontal regions that would support successful encoding of high value information and memory for older adults during the monetary incentive encoding task. So essentially, we thought we would see connectivity between the reward region and prefrontal cortex that would support memory for those high value items for older adults, but not necessarily younger adults. So we used the same task that we had participants do in the lab. So this monetary incentive encoding task, participants again see images preceded by a cue. In this case, we used a high value cue of $5 and a low value cue of 10 cents, telling them how much that image would be worth if they remembered it on the memory task. We also had them do a monetary incentive delay task, and we wanted to use this reaction time task as a functional localizer. So functional localizer involves the comparison of 2 or more conditions to kind of isolate a functionally specialized region or network of regions. So for example, if you show people pictures of faces versus pictures in the scanner, you can isolate the functionally specialized region of the fusiform face area. So we're using this task here to localize the reward network that we can then use in an analysis of the memory task. Retrieval we did 24 hours later, so just the same recognition task that we had done previously. If they get a hit, they earn either the $5 or 10 cents that these items were paired with adding coding. But if they commit a false alarm, so they say old is something that was new, they lose $2.55, which is sort of the value in between our high and low rewards. So just to show you the behavioral findings first. So in our first experiments, just our behavioral experiments, we found younger and older adults remembered those high value items better than low value items. We replicate that here. So both age groups, young adults are in the white bars, older adults in the gray bars. we find that they have very similar patterns of behavior, of memory performance. So a main effective reward on hit rate. We do not actually here find a main effective age. So in our previous studies, older adults were performing worse overall. Here we do not find an effect. Here, older adults are performing just as well as younger adults on this task overall. So first we wanted to see if our findings would replicate those two other studies that had been done that did not find activity in the reward network supported reward enhanced memory for older adults. So we looked at the memory related activity in an ROI that we created from that MID task. So that's what we were using as a functional localizer. So this is the, sort of general findings of activity from that functional localizer when we did a contrast of high greater than low value reward anticipation. This is across younger and older adults. And we chose to, I don't know how well you can see this, but there's a pink sphere around a 6 millimeter sphere around the left caudate, which we used as our region of interest in our memory analyses. And we chose this region in the caudate because it was the most significant cluster that came out of this analysis of the functional localizer of high greater than low value contrast. So here, what we're looking at is during the memory task, during that reward anticipation, does that region of interest in the caudate predict subsequent memory for high value items in either age group? So unlike those two previous studies that I just talked about, we did find activation in this caudate region did predict subsequent memory performance for older adults. So the more that you ramp up this left caudate region, the better your memory performance was for those high value items. So we're looking at subsequent memory here during this reward anticipation phase. So here you can see the caudate region predicts high reward memory performance for both younger and older adults, which is in contrast to those other two studies. So we have a reward by memory interaction, no effects of age. So younger and older adults are doing the same things. What we were most interested in is that functional connectivity and whether there would be age differences in connectivity between the reward region that we chose and we looked at the rest of the brain. And what pulled out of that analysis when we looked at the connectivity between that pink little caudate region and the rest of the brain is connectivity between that region and left and right inferior frontal gyrus. And that connectivity predicted older adults' memory for high value compared to low value items, but not younger adults. So that frontal striatal functional connectivity seems to support reward enhanced memory in older adults, but not younger adults. So I'll kind of wrap up what I've been talking about today. Motivational signaling in the reward network, despite some changes to dopamine as we age, seems to be relatively intact, at least in healthy older adults. Older adults are sensitive to rewards, motivational manipulations, incentives. They can use those incentives to improve on cognitive tasks. In this case, we're showing memory tasks that we know that they typically show age-related deficits on. So they can kind of tap into or use these preserved motivational abilities to help improve performance on tasks that we generally see deficits in, like explicit memory tasks. But older adults may be recruiting some support from prefrontal regions to help them get to the level that we're seeing in the younger adults. So to be able to do this type of task, yes, they can rely on the reward network to the same extent as younger adults, but they seem to be kind of over recruiting, particularly in prefrontal cortex, to kind of get to that level. And as our population is aging, we're always looking for ways to maintain cognitive function, prolong independence. I am not an applied researcher or translational researcher, but perhaps these findings might be useful for creating cognitive or even pharmacological interventions to help us maintain cognitive function as we age. So I will thank some funding support here, people who helped work on a lot of these projects, particularly the imaging projects. And I'll leave these up in case people have questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bowen. So we will now open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand or type it in the chat. I can go ahead and get us started and kick it off with the first question. So some of the tasks you were finding that older adults were performing just as well as younger adults, and then on others they were not. So what do you think was the key difference between some of those tasks? They were similar, right?
Right. So in the behavioral studies we did, we find older adults overall are performing kind of worse than younger adults. But when we did that same task in the scanner, we did not find that effect. So we didn't find a mean effective age. And I think that might be partly due to the participants who are eligible to go in the MRI and who want to go in the MRI. So, people who are getting into the scanner are generally pretty healthy. They haven't had a lot of surgeries or metal in their body, are not claustrophobic, are not taking a lot of medications that might interfere with certain things. And so it may be the case that that group is just healthier, and as a result are not showing typical age-related changes that we might expect, versus where we had, the behavioral study, we had a lot fewer restrictions on who could participate. And so we may have had a sample that was, different than participants who were able to go into the scanner. That's just one
Do
thought.
you think that if, as a follow-up, do you think that if we had less, strict criteria, if we put all more representative group in the scanner, do you think the effects that you found would be strengthened, or do you think that they would be diminished?
Good question. So I didn't get to talk much about this, but there's some debate in the literature about what reward is doing to improve performance. And so there's some people who suggest that reward is improving cognitive control, and cognitive control improves, your encoding and memory performance. And that this is really a strategic kind of process where you're flexibly kind of allocating your processing resources to encode the high value images or words. I didn't talk about my directed forgetting stuff today, but what we're finding from that task and other people have suggested, and our results from our consolidation study suggest that this is more of an automatic process that happens, that rewards signals to your brain that this is important and salient, and this has downstream consequences on hippocampal replay and other things, and that it's more of an automatic process than a strategic process. And so, in a case where maybe you have a sample that's less healthy, it may be the case that reward might not be helpful because they still can't engage in those cognitive control regions. Like if you have an MCI group or some sort of like mild cognitive impairment, something like that, you may not be able to, it may not be helpful enough to engage in those like really strategic processes and cognitive control. But if this is more of an automatic thing that you don't really necessarily have control over, maybe it would still be helpful even in those groups.
Thank you. Okay,
other types of chronic illnesses, I don't know.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Sebastian, go ahead.
Thanks so much. It was really interesting. I wondered when you said reward processing or this network is relatively intact in older adulthood, that this is similar for gains and losses. Is that correct? So my understanding was there was not so much going on in terms of interactions with valence. Is that what you found?
That's correct. Yeah, we have not found any interactions with valence in our studies.
And here my question is, of course, there's all kinds of theoretical ideas, like you could maybe have this ideas that gains are more strongly processed with older age, or even the opposite, that losses are more strongly processed. Do you have some idea why that might not be the case, or how would you interpret this lack of an interaction?
Yeah, it certainly goes against a lot of the positivity bias that we hear about in the aging literature. Um, I have sort of a jaded view of the positivity bias
Mm,
because I'm running a meta-analysis on that right now.
okay.
Um, I think whether so the theory would predict that older adults and some of the findings that I showed at the beginning, which from Greg Samanas Larkin and colleagues has found these valence differences that are in line with what you would predict for a positivity bias for older adults, where they're focusing or they can process gains and wins and rewards better, but maybe avoid processing or can't process losses to the same extent. Um, so I, yeah, I'm sort of debating, about when you might find that effect and whether, again, it has to do with the population that you are testing. And so, part of the, one of the issues in cognitive aging, in the cognitive aging literature is that our samples are typically very healthy. We exclude for a lot of things that are going to affect cognition, like medications and illnesses and things like that. And so I don't think we're necessarily getting typical older adults in our samples and or representative older adults in our samples. And so here it may be the case that these are, again, super healthy older adults, and so they're able to process those losses to the same extent as gains. There's some indication that processing losses is more cognitively taxing, but if you're functioning really high functioning older adult, then maybe that isn't particularly taxing for you. But where we might see these kinds of valence differences is perhaps in older adults who are not as cognitively healthy.
Right. Thank you. And maybe just a quick follow-up. Um, you used in quite a few of the memory tasks recognition memory, and I just wondered whether you have some hypotheses regarding the task demands. And for example, I guess free recall could be more difficult, and or at least also the age differences are typically larger than recognition tasks. I just wonder what you would expect in terms of these incentive effects, whether you would expect they are similar or larger, because you could have this idea. At least this is something we thought about in our lab, is that maybe when more cognitive control is needed, sort of in a memory task, then these incentive effects might play a larger role. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So exactly, recognition memory is one type of memory that where older adults do typically perform better, um, and maybe at the same level as younger adults compared to a free recall task. So Alan Castell's lab has been using free recall tasks with these point values, high and low point values, where they do these study test blocks, and participants are told to try and maximize, their point values by trying to encode those high point value items. And they find that older adults are able to kind of flexibly cognitively control their encoding to really focus on those. And so, yes, typically, I think in those experiments, older adults, we do show like a mean effective age, but that they are able to really select the high value items to remember compared to low point value, which he calls this selectivity effect. Um, so it could be the case, yeah, again, that here in our MRI task, we didn't see an overall mean effective age because we have a group of participants who are really high functioning, and this is a task that typically doesn't show a strong effect of age in terms of overall performance. And so I think in both cases, we're still showing that reward is having an effect, whether it's with recall and rewards and selectivity, or whether it's with recognition. But whether we get an overall mean effective age is always coming through, depending on the task.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Other questions? Yeah, Jasmine or Jasmine?
Hi, thank you for that super interesting talk. So I was wondering, your findings in terms of delayed versus immediate tests, that was quite interesting. And I was wondering to what extent that enhanced effect for incentives or values might be due to cognitive control only during encoding, or whether there might also be enhanced effects of cognitive control during maintenance or during retrieval. And of course, encoding is some sort of a bottleneck here, but and I'm not sure if it really matters. But do you think there could be some effects of, or some enhancing effects on cognitive control also during maintenance and retrieval?
Yeah, I think that's a definite possibility, that there's potentially at the time of retrieval, for example, there could be some engagement of cognitive control, especially because there's a penalty for incorrectly identifying new items. And so, both younger and older adults might be sort of weary to say, or it may change response biases around a little bit, because you don't want to lose that $2.55 in the case of the MRI experiment. I do have some work, not with older adults, showing that actually changing the amount of that false alarm penalty does have an influence on performance. So it's not, just an arbitrary thing to introduce into your study, but the amount of that does actually influence participant responding and overall performance. So it could be the case that, yeah, cognitive control at the time of retrieval is also happening because of that false alarm penalty. But I don't have any older adult data on that exactly.
Thank you.
Great. Other questions? You can also type your question in the chat if you want. We have a request to hear a little bit more on your directed forgetting work. Kind of what you're going through right now, or what you found more recently, a little bit more detail about that.
Sure. So I have a hidden slide here. The goal, so I was thinking about, the things that I just presented now. I've been thinking about what this body of work means. So on the one hand, we have behavioral evidence that high reward value leads to better memory after a delay and after a period of consolidation. So we have this evidence that this effect is happening potentially more automatically rather than in a kind of controlled fashion. But so I guess the on the other hand, we have this recruitment of these like cognitive control regions that are tied to older adults' performance on this task, which is sort of suggesting that at the time of encoding, older adults are recruiting these cognitive control regions to a greater extent, maybe helping, inhibit unwanted information, or maybe engaging in the encoding task more strongly, potentially putting more effort in. So these sort of seemed like, different things going on, maybe at the same time. But we decided to kind of test whether it was automatic or controlled processes that are going on by using a directed forgetting task. So I'm just gonna move this over so you can see my slides. So a directed forgetting task theoretically relies on the engagement of cognitive control over encoding processes. So at the time that you are seeing those images, you are, or words in this case, you are engaging in controlled processes to help you either remember or try to forget something that you've seen. So if you're not familiar with directed forgetting, typically we use words. This is an item level directed forgetting task where participants see a word, and then after the word, they get a cue telling them whether they need to remember that word or whether they should forget that word. And in our case, we're looking at younger versus older adults. And what we typically find in a directed forgetting task like this is that even though you think about aging as being associated with like unintentional forgetting, in this type of task, when you tell older adults to forget some items, they actually have a hard time doing so. So they actually will remember more of these items that they were told to forget than younger adults. And so we wanted to introduce a reward to see whether we could boost older adults' performance on this task and essentially boost their forgetting abilities. So if it's the case that forgetting requires cognitive control over your memory and rewards boost cognitive control, then we should see that older adults perform better on a task of forgetting when we give them an incentive to do so. So we just kind of modified this task a little bit and introduced a reward with the stimulus. So on the screen, they got a high or low value reward, and they were told that that reward is for following the memory instructions. So they would get $1 for remembering this word links, or they would get 1 cent if they forgot the word yard on the memory test. And this was, again, to sort of look at these competing hypotheses about whether rewards are increasing cognitive control. In that case, we would see a boost to, or we would see that older adults are better able to forget high value items compared to younger adults. But if rewards are really just leading to this sort of automatic engagement of dopaminergic sort of hippocampal modulation of long-term memory processes, then rewards actually might make forgetting even harder. And so this is just, we did 4 different experiments where we kind of changed things around a little bit, but generally what we find is that rewards boost memory. They do not help with forgetting in either age group. So what I'm showing, I don't know how well you can see these different colors, but high reward items are red, low reward items are green, and this is the hit rate. So these are the number of items that people forget when they were supposed to remember compared to when they were told to forget. And so you can see that the green bars are never higher than the red bars for forgetting, which is what you might expect if reward was helping people to forget those items better. So we never see that effect. We see that reward is boosting memory performance, regardless of the memory cue to remember or forget. And this was true for both younger and older adults. And you can see just kind of generally for the to be forgotten items, older adults bars are higher than the to be forgotten items for younger adults, meaning they're remembering more items they were supposed to forget. So we get the typical, directed forgetting effect in aging. Reward is not helping that at all. So we sort of concluded that this was more evidence that high reward anticipation was leading to kind of automatic versus controlled processes at the time of encoding.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. We have time for a few more questions if anyone else has something about either this work or what she talked about earlier. Yes, Kim.
Thanks so much, Holly. Great talk. I was just thinking about some of the prior work that you had discussed in the conversation about reward modulation of recognition memory. And I was just curious if you're aware, I'm not, and so I was just wondering if you know of prior work in the literature that has looked at younger and older adults' memory performance using recall specifically and reward incentives. Sebastian noted, recall is more difficult, and especially with this speculation that the older adults that might be in these kinds of studies, especially neuroimaging ones, are really high performers. I'm just curious whether something like a recall paradigm would help to maybe parse out age-related differences a little bit more if the older adult group are really strong performers, and if there's any work that you know of that's out there in the literature.
The only, well, the work that I'm most familiar with recall is Alan Castell's work with the selectivity. I haven't run any recall tasks with reward with older adults. So I can't, uh, using rewards anyway, I'm not off the top of my head familiar with recall versus recognition with rewards with older adults. Other studies with younger adults that I've run, we found bigger effect sizes for recall over recognition
Mm-hmm.
when using high and low value rewards. And I'm trying to remember now from Kim and I have been running a meta-analysis, not with aging, but reward effects on
Yeah.
memory. And I'm trying to remember now. I believe that also came out in the recall versus recognition analysis
Oops.
that we ran overall. I think that if I'm remembering correctly, that is what happened. But again, that's not with aging. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I wonder, yeah, with aging, in these healthy samples, I think the Castell lab often finds just like overall main effects of age, but they still find these like big sensitivity or selectivity findings of high versus low point values. And here, depending on the sample, we find main effects of age or not main effects of age, but still
Right.
see, these differences in high versus low value.
Yeah.
Great. I
Thank you.
think for at least one more question. Okay. If no one has one, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much to Dr. Bowen for the wonderful talk and all the questions, answering all the questions. We will be back on July 8th, correct? To correct me if I'm wrong, right? With Dr. Alexandra Cohen. So join us then in a few weeks, and we will see you then. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks, Holly.